Hello guys, so welcome to Blue Tech Empire main stack tutorials. In this tutorials, I'm going to be starting up with JavaScript. So this is our starting point and this is where we begin our journey on the main stack. But we are going to complete JavaScript first before diving into the main stack. That's MongoDB, Express, React JS, and Node.js. So this is our first video on JavaScript. I'm going to be giving you guys a general introduction to JavaScript so you can get started with JavaScript. And in this video, I am expect you to know a little bit of HTML and CSS. If you don't know HTML and CSS, then I'll give you a link to our channel where we teach HTML CSS. So you're supposed to know a little bit of HTML and CSS before taking on this video. But if you're okay just learning straight away from JavaScript, then you'll be able to go on with this video. So let's get started. I'm going to dive directly into the code, but if you want to know more about the history of JavaScript, when it started and all those, you can go online and follow through on that. So as for me, I'll just be I'm trying to teach you guys how to code, so I'll leave all that extra flesh due to the size of the video. So let's get started. Let's write the basic HTML structure so that we can begin writing our code. So here is Visual Studio Code, which I'll be using to do to program. I'll also put a link in the description where you can see how to get it installed on your computer. You can also check online, very easy. You can easily install Visual Studio Code on your computer. But one thing you need to do if you want to code with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript is to go to packages, extensions, yes, and you need to have an internet connection, and you go to extensions and you type JavaScript like this. You will see a couple of extensions, so you need to install this one. I want you to see the ones I've installed. You can install them like this one. You can also install, in fact, this one, I think this one is okay. This one too, you can install this one, JavaScript ES6 code snippets. You can install this Babel. We'll be using Babel when we start React JS. So you can also install let's see, I think you can install these two, JavaScript debugger companion, but I think the main one you should install is this JavaScript ES6 code snippet and maybe Babel. You can also find anyone of interest to you. You can just check their name and you can also install those ones. But in that case, you can also type CSS and you can also see HTML and CSS support. So you can also install this one. I've already installed most of them, that's why I'm not installing. You can also install this one, IntelliSense for CSS class names in HTML, and you can also install this one, HTML to CSS auto completion. So and maybe this one. So but the main ones are this one is the main one for CSS. So lastly, we'll go to HTML, and you can install HTML snippets. I already showed you this one, and you can also install this one. So basically, that's all you actually need those are all the packages you need to be able to use HTML in Visual Studio Code. Unlike Python, the video I'm going to put in the description, it talks about Python, how to install Python on Visual Studio Code, but you don't need that. Once you install it, once you install Visual Code from the video, just come right here to pack extensions, and you can install those extensions I've shown you. And once you do that, you're ready to code in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript using Visual Studio Code. So now I'll go, let me write some basic HTML that will help us to start our JavaScript journey. So once in Visual Studio Code, you can use the exclamation sign like this, and you use the Emmet abbreviation. Once you use it's like a shortcut to get the HTML backbone, or just to get an initial HTML template. You can use this exclamation sign followed by enter. You have like a shortcut. Right now we have the HTML template, a basic HTML template. I can remove the ones I don't want, but let's see. All right, so I want all this, so I can just change the title to JavaScript script basics. All right, so now I have my head, I have my body, and I'm ready to go. So initially, I'm going to show you how to get a basic JavaScript. You start with the script tag, and once we get to the script tag, yeah, all right, we already have it closed. So from here now, you can write any JavaScript code. So this is actually called an inline script. Remember, you can have a script here, or you can have a script within the head tag. We'll mostly be using the script within the head tag in the future, and the external style, external scripts in the future. But for now, I'm going to be using what we call the embedded scripts. So what we call an embedded script is a script which is the um, within the body element of the HTML document. So it's just most times we use this for basic JavaScript. When you're writing complicated programs, you always realize you'll be using external scripts, or most times you'll be using embedded scripts. So these ones we call them inline scripts because they're within the body of the HTML document. So for this video, we are going to mostly be using this inline scripts. So for the script type, we usually have an attribute called a type attribute. By default, this type attribute is set to text JavaScript. That's for a script tag. The type attribute is usually set to text JavaScript by default, but sometimes we just want to write it. So we have text JavaScript. This is actually the main type of JavaScript file. It's a text file and it's a JavaScript file. So we write text JavaScript, and here now we can write our code. So our first code can be document.write line, and we can just say welcome to JavaScript. Here is a very trivial example. So let's just see how this one will be shown on the browser. So I can go here and I'll open this I'll open in File Explorer to see, and I'll open it with Chrome. So Firefox in this case. All right. So what we need to do is you see welcome to JavaScript, but I want to be able to see the console because I'm going to show you guys something we're going to be using. You go to more tools, sometimes you see web development tool, and let's go to the console. So most time as a programmer, when developing, you always want to use the console, especially when coding in JavaScript. The console will help you to do a lot of debugging, and it's very important for you. And I'll advise you, every time when you're developing a website, always have the console at the side. You can use it to print documents, you can use it to check a lot of stuff, you can even use it to inspect your HTML elements and those stuff. We are going to be looking at some of those stuff later, but let's just continue with our basic JavaScript example. So I'm going to close this here. So you see document.writeLine, and so what this does is it actually just attach this text here. It actually attaches this text here to the HTML document. So this is a very trivial example. Most times you aren't going to see document.writeLine in most JavaScript in real websites because it's very dangerous to use it. I'm going to explain to you the danger later on, but for now, since we are doing basic JavaScript, we are going to be using this document.writeLine, or we can also use console.log. You can use console.log hello world. So here is another example. Let's see how this one does. This one is going to be displayed on the console. So yeah, so we have hello world here, and you can see it was displayed on line 17 or 13, sorry. So line 13 column 17. So this is a basic JavaScript example. So as noted, we have two statements, one on line 12, one on line 13. Now, a basic JavaScript statement is terminated with a semicolon. You can remove this semicolon and your script is still valid. But sometimes it's advisable to use it if you're coming from a programming language like C or PHP, where semicolons are necessary, you may find yourself using semicolons everywhere. And if sometimes you switch between this type of languages, you always want to use semicolon. But if you're coming from a language like Python, where semicolons are optional, you can forget about the semicolon. But there are points where you need to use a semicolon, or a semicolon is compulsory. For example, if you want to separate two lines, if you want two lines, two statements on the same line, you must separate them with semicolons like this. So console.log, that's if you want more than one statement. I love programming. So in this case, you must separate them with semicolons. If you don't, it's a mistake in JavaScript. So as you can see, it's going to generate an error, and our code is not going to be run. So as you can see, nothing has been displayed. There's an error. So let's see. So you see uncaught syntax error and all those stuff. So our console also tells us in case there was an error during the execution. If the console is not active, you aren't going to see this particular error. So sometimes the console is very necessary because it shows us some error which we wouldn't see if the console wasn't open. So let's go back to our code. In this case, we have to separate them with colon. Most times, especially sometimes if you're writing very short statements, you usually put more than one on the same line. But if that's not the case, you have statements on different lines like this, and you can omit the semicolon. It doesn't have any problem. So everything is going to be fine. So here are three statements in JavaScript. The basic JavaScript building block is a statement. So, and statements are separated by semicolons, or if they are on separate lines, then you don't need to separate them with semicolons. Now I'm going to show you how to use functions. So we're going to start our introduction with JavaScript using with functions. We have seen statements on separate lines, and there are multiple statements in JavaScript, So I'm going to show you how to use functions. So let's write the function right now. So to write the function, you start with the function keyword, and you give the function a name. Let's say display message. I'm using what is called the camel casing. With camel casing, you start with a lowercase, but each subsequent word, like message, for example, starts with an uppercase letter. Some people also use this. I've forgotten the name, but some people also use this kind of way to write variable names, for example. So here is an identifier. We are going to learn more about that. A valid identifier, for example, does not start with a number, and it cannot have a space between. For example, you cannot write it like this. So we have a function called display message, and we want to see how it behaves. So display message, so here we have the function arguments parameter list. This function takes no parameter. I'm going to explain to you more about that later, but this function takes no parameters, so its parameter list is empty. So what will this function do? For example, this function will console.log should tell us, wow, you called me. So this function just tells us you called me. Okay, console.log and I responded. So now let's execute let's try to run our script and see what happens. So when we run, you see hello world, I love programming. As you can see, this function was not executed. What happens if you want to execute? Normally when JavaScript is processing our code or our script, for example, when the browser is processing or executing our JavaScript, each statement is being executed, but statements within a function are not executed. The function is only passed. It means it's just the function is just like checked for errors, but no statement within the function is executed. So as you can see, for example, you called me has not been executed. I have responded has not been executed, as you can see from the console. So let's change this to document.writeLine. All right, so let's see what happens if So you see nothing happens. So to call a function, you need to use its name. So you can see the name of this function is display message, and you can see it takes no parameter. So our argument list here is empty, as you can see, because the function takes no parameter. We are going to look at functions that take parameter later on, but this function takes no parameter. So when calling it, for example, you have an empty argument list. So, and the function returns nothing. You are going to look at functions that actually return something. So this function, let's call it one time and see what happens. Okay, so wow, you see, you called me, have responded. So to make things better, let's add a new line before, HTML. A new line is br, the br element, the break element. So let's see how it happens here. All right, you called me and have responded. So that's a simple example of calling the function. You can call a function multiple times. That's the advantage of a function. You write code in one place and you can use it in multiple places. So for example, I'm going to call this, let's say after each of these, we have document dot write line, and we have something like this, and we have a br tag. All right, let's see what happens. I've called the function 3 times. So you see it's executed 3 times, and we can see the three displayed. So you can write a function one time and use it multiple times. If you wanted to do that without using a function, then we had to write this line repeatedly 3 times. That's about 9 lines of code, but because we already defined it as a function, now we have 3 lines of code calling it 3 times. So here is an example of a simple function. So the statement within a function are encompassed or are within braces, curly braces. This is known as a code block. So for example, we can say a function block. Every statement within the curly braces can be called the body of the function. A function can have one statement within its body or within its block, or it can have multiple statements like this case. So once each like at the end of this code block, it's the browser considers the function, it acts like the endpoint of the function. So the function starts here and actually ends here or here. So just understand, code within a function are within braces, and that's known as the block or a code block. We are going to see a lot of importance, especially when dealing with variable and variable scopes. You're going to understand the meaning of a block. Yeah, but in this case, just understand the statements within a functions are within the function block or within a code block. So now let's write another function. In this time, we are going to look at the function that takes in arguments, or a function that has parameters or which you can pass in arguments. So for example, let's look at another function. This function, remember, you can have any number of functions you want in your scripts, any number you want. There's no limit to the number of functions that can be in a script. So we are going to call this function greet user, and it takes the name as the first parameter and it takes the age as the second parameter. So now we are going to call this function. Let's first write the body of the function. That was an error. We are going to write the body of the function right now. So what will the function do? It will actually form a message to greet the user. So it's going to say document dot write line, and you say welcome. All right, so here is a brief string where I have welcome plus name. Whatever the user passes as a name will be attached to the welcome, and whatever the user passes as age will be attached to this. So here is a simple function that takes a parameter. When I will execute it, you're going to see how it's going to behave. But now let's try to call that function. Let's say greet user, and let's say I give it a name, and I give it an age of 40, for example. Let's see what happens. So let's say it should start with a break, so that there should be space, and let's see. So you see, welcome Emmanuel, you are 40 years old. Now let's try to change it a bit. Let's change it to Dan. Let's change it to 30. Or let's even create some stuff. Um, let's call it twice and see the behavior. All right, see, welcome Emmanuel, you are 40 years old. Welcome Dan, you are 30 years old. So what happens now? Because this function actually has two parameters, we actually need to call it with two arguments. We need to pass two arguments when calling it. It's going to consider the first argument we pass to be stored in a variable called name. I'm going to show you guys what variable means. We're going to learn about variables later on. Then it's going to store the second parameter pass in a value called age. So each time you call it, for example, in this first case where we called it on line 26, before the function execute, Emmanuel is going to be name while 40 is going to be age. In the second call, Emmanuel is going, name, Dan is going to be name, and age is going to be 30. You can also call it again if you want, greet user, and you can see we cannot say, let's say John, and we have, let's say 55. All right, so in this case, you see, in this case, when you call it, John is going to be name, and 55 is going to be age. So as you can see, all right, so there is it. So what happens here is once the function is called, it takes the first parameter pass, the second parameter pass, and it uses it to form a string. And we are going to learn about strings later on, but it uses it to form a string which is actually displayed with a document.write line. Another way to do it is just to first create a variable to store the string. All right, so you see, in this case, we first created the string by appending stuff together. You know, when you use the plus with string, it's called concatenation. We are attaching whatever variable, whatever value was passed in name, we are attaching it to welcome, and whatever value was passed in age, we are attaching it to UR, then followed by years old. So that's why we can have something like welcome, whatever you pass in name, UR, whatever you pass in age, then we have years old. So that's simply how a function that takes a parameter. Now you can pass more parameters, but they are going to be ignored. For example, if I pass other parameters, you know, this function actually takes only two parameters, but if I pass a third parameter, it's still going to run. It's not an error, but it's going to be ignored. It's going to be ignored because there's no provision, or there's no parameter name for this third argument. Now if you pass less parameters, you're going to have a problem because now age is going to be undefined, because only you passed only one, which is going in for name, and the second one you had to that's age. You didn't pass it, so it's going to have a value undefined. By default, JavaScript variables have the value undefined. So let's see, you're going to have something like uh, undefined. So you are undefined years old. So you should understand, if you don't pass enough variables, the ones you haven't passed are going to be undefined. So that's something you should take note about. So in summary, for functions with arguments, when you want to call a function, or when you want to invoke a function that actually takes parameters, you need to pass those parameters as arguments. So arguments are what you pass to the function, while the parameters are like what the function takes in. So a function is defined with parameters. This function has no parameter. That's why the parameter list is empty. But this function has two parameters, and note each parameter is separated by a comma, and the parameters, unlike other programming language, don't have any type attached to them, so they are loosely typed. You can say JavaScript is a loosely typed language. I'm going to talk more about that when we learn about on variables. So in this case here, I told you this one is going to be ignored, and in this bed now we have two parameters are passed, two arguments are passed to the function each time the function is called. Forgive me, sometimes I make mistakes with parameters and arguments, but when you call a function, you actually pass it arguments while the function takes in parameters. So that's the simplicity of functions that take in parameters. Next, let's look at functions that take return a value. Most of these functions we have used, they actually just take in parameters and do their work. They don't return anything to the calling code. So now we are going to see functions that return a value. For example, they'll do something like they'll perform a task and they'll return their result back to the caller. So for example, these functions, if you point them, for example, you see we have void. Void indicates the function returns no value. As you can see, this function returns void. You see void at the end, it means it returns no value. Now I'm going to show you an example of a function that returns a value. Now let's write this function instead of printing this same function. Instead of printing document the write line message, let it return the message, for example. Now for if you want to return a variable from a function, you use what we call the return keyword. Return followed by whatever you want to return. This can even be a string like this message, or let's say this can even be a name. Loved it, for example. You can return you can return whatever you want to return. It mustn't be a variable, but in this case, let's return love it. Okay, now when you call a function that returns a value, you must if you want to store the value returned by the function, you will need to use an assignment operator. For example, if I need to store that value, I can say result equals to, I will call the function now greet user, and I'll say name. I'll give it a name Dan, and I'll give it an age. Now what happens is, calling the function is going to perform all once the function is executed, it's going to perform its tasks and it's going to return love it. So result is going to be equal to love it. Whatever a function returns become the result of calling the function. So whatever this function returns is going to be stored in results. So as you can see, let's now print console.log, and let's see what result. Let's just print the result. All right, let's see what happens. You should expect to see something on the console. Okay, let's see. All right, so you see here we have love it. Here. So you can see the function was called, it returned love it, and I actually printed the result. You can see if I add something here, result, so that you actually know the result of the function. If I print that here, you can see result loved it. Now let's return instead of returning love it, let's return the message that was constructed. Message. Okay, and now let's print the result. Now you're going to see, if for example we don't print this message, let's see what happens. Oh, you see here we have just I love programming. In fact, let me use now once we get the result, let's use document dot write line, and let's use the bold tag so that you see it clearly. B plus result plus B. Okay, sorry, B. So I am appending this together. Let's see what happens. So you see, welcome Dan, you are 45 years old. So as you can see, I called the function and the function returned something. I actually took that stuff the function returned and saved it in a variable called result. So now result actually has whatever was returned by the function greet user, and now I can display that result on the console. I use the bool tag to attach to concatenate it to whatever I stored in the result, and then later concatenated the remaining bold. I'm going to show you a different way of writing strings, which is called template strings, which is a new feature in Java that helps you to easily write strings. So let's write other functions, like a function that does sum and a function that does product, and so we can see how the return value actually works. Alright, so here are two functions. We have one called sum and another one called product. So the first function actually takes two parameters. It names them A and B, and it returns A plus B, that's the sum of A and B, while the second one takes two arguments. It also names them A and B, but we can name them var1 and var2 if you like, and it will return the product of var1 and var2. Now we can easily call these functions. First, let's start by calling var. Let's say my sum equals to, I'm going to call the function sum and I'm going to pass it two arguments. In this case, let me pass it 3 and 12. And let's call my product var my, let me create a variable called my product. So this variable will be used to store whatever is returned by product of 10, 10 and 30. So let's see. Now calling the function returns these two and it returns a value, in this case a plus b, in this case var1 times var2. But as you can see, I just saved the values in these variables. I haven't printed them yet, so you're gonna see you don't have any display yet. But now I'm going to print them out. So I'm going to print, first I'm going to say let's use the let's use document dot write. In fact, let's do something here. Let's write the function to do the printing for us in bold. So let's create a function here called let's create a function called print result function print results. Since it's something we do quite often, the function takes one parameter called message and it prints that parameter document dot write line. Print that parameter within bold br. It starts with break, then it goes to bold, for example, and print that parameter out message, and it actually ends with also a closing bold tag. And as you can see, finally we can now call it here. So let's call it here print results. The first one is my sum, no colon my sum, and the next one we have print results, and we have my product. So now let's see. So here we have 15 and 30. So my sum is 15 and my product is 30. So there is an example of calling a function that returns a value. In the case here, the function returns a string, but here you see it returns any, which means it can be a string or a number. So if a function has the ability to return a string or a number, JavaScript, the browser usually calls it any. That's any kind of parameter. Even in this case here, you see we have a number. While the ID is a bit confused, is that plus can be used to append two strings, but here a multiplication can only be used between two numbers. That's why the browser knows here the function returns a number. So as you can see, if you point the function here, you see this one's return nothing, while this one returns a number, and this one returns any. That can be a string, a number, or some other variable type. So now you can use a variable within you can use the variable to store the value before returning it. So for example, I can say var result equals to a plus b. Then now I can return results. I can do that, or I can do that same here. So you can use a variable to temporarily store the result first before returning it. Usually it's not necessary if you don't have probably a couple of statements inside, because storing it in the variable and then returning it is just like wastage of lines of code or something like that. But you see, for this easy case, sometimes you won't do that. And but let's look at a situation where you might want to store the result in a variable first and then returning the variable. You may want to do it on two separate lines. For example, let's write an average function, for example, a function that gets the average of, let's say, four numbers. So the function, we can give it a name, get average, and it takes. So here is the function. You can still do all this in one line, but you realize doing it in multiple lines make it more clearer. And when doing mathematics in JavaScript, it's also very advisable to use braces. In board maths we learned in back in primary school or basic education. We have brackets actually is at a very high precedence. So for example, if without bracket, this is not going to work, because it's going to be d divided by 4, and then a plus b plus c is going to be added to d divided by 4, because division has a higher precedence than addition. So in this case, you'll be wise to use something like this, so that the bracket is first, the content of each bracket is first um, computed before it's divided by 4. So in this case, we're going to have a, b, c, d. It's going to be computed and the result is then going to be divided by 4, just because of the braces. So in this case, we can see, if we call average now, var my av is equals to get average, calling it with, so let's call it like this, and let's display message my var my app. Remember, the display message is a function we actually wrote here just to simplify things for us. So those are, in the first place, those are the use. You have called me, I responded no. Not display message, let's see, print results, sorry. So print results, okay. So let's see, all right, so 6.25. all right, so let's move to the next stuff we're going to be learning. Let's say, just so that this video shouldn't be too long, I'm going to stop this video here. So in the next video, I'm going to be showing you guys how to use primitive type. That's primitive types in JavaScript. We're going to look at booleans, strings, numbers, and then we're also going to look how to use JavaScript objects. So at this point, I'm going to end this video here, and make sure to check the descriptions for the link on installing Visual Studio Code and any other important link. All right, so see you in the next video, and have a nice day.